DevilNeverCry.
What is up, everybody? It is me, DevilNeverCry, and we are back with another video on Final Fantasy 16. Today's video serves as a roundup of all the recent news we've got on FF16, thanks to a plethora of interviews with the game's producer, Naoki Yoshida. For the sake of brevity, not wanting to read out the interviews word for word, I'll be picking up on a few key topics, but I'll leave a link in the description to all of these interviews that you can read in your own time. Without further ado, let's dive in. The first important topic in question I want to cover is why did they choose an action-based battle system for Final Fantasy 16? Yoshida goes on to state that they've decided to set the game in a classical fantasy setting mixed with an action battle system in an attempt to appeal to as many people as possible. He then goes on to state that he knows that not every player out there will be all too confident with an action-based battle system, and for those players who might struggle, there'll be comprehensive support so that they can enjoy the game, potentially alluding to a classic mode solution that they implemented in Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it was an interesting mix, I suppose, of real-time and turn-based. Further along in the answer, Yoshida mentions that the reason they decided to go this path with Final Fantasy XVI is to push the boundaries of Final Fantasy and what it really is, and perhaps laying the groundwork for any further developers who wish to take up the reins in the future. Personally, I think this is an answer that we were all expecting, myself included. Yes, there are a few stalwart RPG series out there that have stuck with turn-based combat, but a lot of RPGs that were conventionally turn-based have now shifted to real-time action, just like Final Fantasy with Final Fantasy 15 before it. And in general, the entire legacy of Final Fantasy is that every game is different, and the combat system along with it. You had the materia system in Final Fantasy 7, the junction system in 8, all the way to gambits in 12, and of course, real-time as mentioned in Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15 didn't personally leave me feeling all too confident with its combat system, but seeing what they've done with FF16 and the fact that they've got a combat designer from the DMC series working on this game, I definitely am hopeful. Moving on to the next topic, we come up against something that is quite controversial in that Yoshida confirms that Final Fantasy 16 will not be a fully open world title. Instead, the game will divide up its regions into more contained areas, whilst at the same time taking inspiration from other AAA games. The idea is to focus on these independent areas to help give players a sense of a global scale. And with that final comment there, I'm assuming it means that we'll be jumping essentially all over the globe, if that makes sense, in an attempt to give the sense of a journey and provide a grander sense of scale to the game overall. Going into the announcement of this game, I honestly wasn't quite sure how they were going to manage the whole open world aspect. After all, Final Fantasy is again fairly synonymous with the idea of an open world, but we are now no longer in the realm of the PlayStation, if that makes sense. Budgets for AAA games are incredibly massive, yes, but to do a massive open world with the attention to detail and the graphical fidelity that you'd normally expect from a cutting-edge Final Fantasy, I'm not quite sure if that would have been feasible for them to do financially, but also from a technological perspective, how they would have done it, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps the current gen might be able to with the SSDs and streaming and whatnot, but I wasn't quite sure. But it does seem as though we will have these separate instanced areas which will have the attention to detail and graphical fidelity that we all come to expect. I think they were trying to avoid what they did with Final Fantasy 15, where they potentially promised this open world, which, as we all know, didn't really turn out to be all that true, considering that certain areas were not accessible and you couldn't fully explore other areas, and other areas were set pieces altogether just to get to a specific region of the map, and it was kind of a mess. And I think that by going this route, that they've made a very smart decision for themselves. And the controversial topics don't stop there. In a previous video, I'd mentioned that they had suspiciously been focusing solely on Clive the main character, that is, for those of you who don't know, whenever we saw gameplay on any of the trailers, and I suspected that Clive would be the only playable character, and that has been confirmed. Yoshida's gone on to state that Clive will of course be joined by other party members, but they will be solely AI driven. Now what's interesting is that Final Fantasy 15 was largely the same. You could literally only control Noctis. However, thanks to the inclusion of a bunch of DLC, you ended up being able to control the other party members. So, fingers crossed, potentially there will be a title update somewhere down the line, way after release, where we may be able to control some of these AI-driven characters. Pressing ahead, let's talk about the icons, the summons of Final Fantasy 16, and just what we've learned about them. In the world of VALISTHEA, which is the world in which Final Fantasy 16 takes place, each different nation has somebody called a dominant, who is the sole person who is able to summon forth the power of an icon by literally becoming the icon themselves. And what's interesting about these icons is that they are essentially, as Yoshida puts them, nuclear bombs, weapons of mass destruction. They are there not to be used, but more of a deterrent for any other nation who attempts to invade or go to war. And in a sense, MAD is in effect here, mutually assured destruction. You use your icon, I use my icon, and essentially it's a zero-sum game. Nobody really wins. And that's why there's been an uneasy peace in the world of VALISTHEA so far. And then we come into another key plot point, which is the Mother Crystals. Because of course it can't be a Final Fantasy without crystals being involved somehow, and I'm not talking about crystal meth. So, the Mother Crystals in the world of VALISTHEA have been alluded to directly be oil fields, in a sense of they supply the land with energy, with ether. They store this ether within themselves, and it's this energy that is used to power magic throughout the land. Ether is now becoming a limited resource. The Mother Crystals essentially have begun to dry up, and of course this has prompted nations to invade and go to war with each other over this energy. And that is where the icons come into play. They're there to stop these events from happening, and now the time is at hand and war has consumed the land. Despite this game having a classic fantasy setting, that is a very contemporary story that they're going for that might hit close to home for some people. Now, what's interesting is that Yoshida directly states that players will be able to control a 2-scale summon of their own, and that it is both unique and exciting, as it's something the series hasn't really delved into or explored at all. And I, for one, am absolutely looking forward to melting some poor chap's face off with a Mega Flare from Bahamut himself. On the topic of icons, we do have confirmation that each icon will have their own ability tree. In the Dominance trailer, we saw Clive switch between the power of different icons, and it's confirmed that Clive will be able to earn points during battle, which will then be able to be spent on those ability trees to unlock further abilities. Nothing necessarily groundbreaking, but it is great to have confirmation that there'll be more to do with these icons' power than just essentially unlock them for the first time. And from the sounds of the interview, it looks like we'll be able to customize these ability trees to suit our own playstyles. Jumping away to a different topic, we have confirmation that the lore of Final Fantasy 16 will largely be self-contained, and there won't be any tertiary lore material such as the lore book that we had for Final Fantasy 14. There'll be multiple different time skips throughout the game's story, with a lot happening in the background during those different time skips. And as such, to provide further context as to what's happened, not only will there be a bunch of side quests to help you get up to speed with the world, but there'll also be an in-game compendium and a lot of stuff in general to read in-game to help the player, again, further contextualize themselves in the story depending on where they are at that point in time, so to speak. I'm curious to see just how detailed these in-game compendiums really are. And of course, though we do have confirmation that a lore book is not currently in the works, who's to say that fan demand won't actually be there and be so overwhelming where they decide to do put a lore book out in the end. But I digress. Moving on to the last topic at hand for this video, an absolute shocker, you'll have your mind blown if I say so myself. Final Fantasy 16 will only have British VA for its English localization. And the reason behind that decision? They didn't want to break the immersion of the medieval classic fantasy setting, stating that it would be weird for players to get so ingrained in this world only to have that shattered when they hear somebody speaking in an American dialect, speaking American English, which means you better get used to a bunch of enemies and guards shouting, "Oi governor, you got a license for that sword?" Or random peasants saying, "Oh, I really could use a bottle of water." And with that, we come to the end of this video. As mentioned, I touched upon a few key topics, and if you want to read all these interviews in full, I'll leave a link to each of them in the description down below. If you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing, as there is more content on the way. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.